The silence in my shop was a carefully constructed lie. It was a thick, artificial quiet maintained by 4 illegal acoustic dampeners buried in the corners of the room, vibrating at a frequency that canceled out the perpetual, teeth-grinding groan of the industrial sector below. People in the rust, that's what we called the lower 5 levels of Aethelgard, didn't get silence. They got the bass, heavy thrum of gravity pumps and the rhythmic screaming of recycled air. But in my narrow sliver of a workspace, tucked between a heavy water processor and a synthetic noodle stall, the air was still. I liked it that way. Machines don't talk, but they do sing, and you can't hear the song if the world is screaming at you. I was currently wrist-deep in the guts of a vintage logic controller, trying to convince its rusted synaptic relays that it wasn't a piece of scrap metal. My fingers, stained with conductive grease and scarred by 1,000 minor electrical arcs, moved with a precision that didn't belong in a hole-in-the-wall shop. I wasn't a man of many words. I was a man of 38 years who found the heat death of the universe less intimidating than a polite conversation. Then the notification pinged. It wasn't the dull chime of a customer at the door. It was a high-frequency, crystalline note that cut through my acoustic dampeners like a hot wire through butter. It came from the tablet docked on my workbench, a battered piece of tech I use for schematic overlays. The screen flared into life, casting a brilliant emerald green glow over my greasy coveralls. A logo I hadn't seen in 10 years spiraled in the center. The Nexus match. "What in the void?" I muttered, my voice raspy from hours of disuse. The Nexus match was the plaything of the high-born Felinari up in the Spire. It was an elite social pairing application that used bioharmonic resonance to find your perfect biological and social counterpart. It was supposed to be impossible to access without a verified genetic key from the great houses. I didn't have a key. I had a fake ID, a mountain of regrets, and a very strong desire to remain invisible. The screen flickered, and a message scrolled across the display in elegant, flowing script. Bioharmonic compatibility detected 99.9%. Subject: Alpha, Silas Vane, identified via Legacy Archon Protocol. Subject Beta, Elora of House Valerius. Status: match confirmed. Tracing subject Alpha location for immediate protocol initiation. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It attempted to jump out of my chest and run for the nearest airlock. Legacy Archon Protocol. Those 4 words were a death sentence. They were the digital ghost of the man I used to be, the architect who had built the very grid that powered this vertical nightmare of a city. "Aborting," I hissed, my fingers blurring over the screen. "Delete cache. Force shutdown. Purge system." The tablet laughed at me. Not literally, but the way the progress bar refused to move felt like a mockery. Then the walls of my shop began to rattle. This wasn't the usual vibration of the rust. This was heavy. This was the sound of displacement drives, military grade, descending from the upper clouds. I looked at the chrono on the wall. 3 minutes. It had taken exactly 3 minutes for a match to be made and for the hounds to be released. "Great," I whispered, grabbing my heavy leather jacket and a roll of specialized tools. So much for a quiet Tuesday. I kicked the manual release for the shop's back shutters. The metal groaned, protesting the sudden movement. Outside, the narrow alleyway was filled with the usual humid smog, but looking up, I saw the blue-white glare of searchlights cutting through the haze. 12 black armored interceptors were dropping like stones from the Emerald District. These weren't the local precinct cops with their battered cruisers and bad attitudes. These were the Admiral's Guard, the Felinari elite. "Silas Vane!" A voice boomed from the sky, amplified by a resonance caster that made my internal organs vibrate. "You are in violation of the Social Stability Act. Remain where you are and prepare for bioharmonic verification." "Yeah, that's a hard bounce, Ghost Rider," I muttered, sliding through the gap in the shutters. I didn't run like a criminal. I moved like a man who knew the blueprints of the city. I knew that the ventilation shaft behind the noodle stall was connected to the secondary cooling trunk. I knew that if I hit the gravity lane at a 45-degree angle, I could bypass the local scanners. I was halfway down the alley when a silhouette dropped from the roof above, landing with the silent grace of a predator. It was a girl, or rather, a young Felinari woman. She couldn't have been more than 19 years old. Even under the grime of the rust, she stood out like a diamond in a coal bin. She wore a coat of shimmering synthetic silk that shifted from violet to gold as she moved, though the hem was torn and stained with soot. Her triangular ears were pressed flat against her head in distress, and her amber eyes, wide and glowing with a faint, bioluminescent spark, were locked onto me. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was dragging a bike. It was a sleek, teardrop-shaped machine, a custom anti-gravity interceptor that probably cost more than my entire city block. But it wasn't floating. It was scraping along the ground, its primary repulsors emitting a dying, discordant whine that made my teeth ache. "You!" she gasped, her voice trembling. "The app! The match!" "It said you were here. It said you were the one who could hear it." I stopped dead. The searchlights were getting closer. The roar of the interceptors was deafening now. "Kid, you picked a really bad time for a date. The Admiral's Guard is about to turn this sector into a parking lot because of that app." "I didn't call them!" she cried, stepping into the light. Tears were streaking her porcelain-pale face. "My mother. She triggered the trace the moment the match was confirmed. She thinks you kidnapped my digital signature. But I pushed the bike here. I need you to fix it. Please." I looked at the bike. I looked at the girl. My brain screamed at me to keep running, to dive into the sewers and disappear for another decade. But then I heard it. The bike wasn't just broken, it was screaming. Beneath the mechanical grinding, there was a specific harmonic frequency, a jagged, pulsing note that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a part of the engine's design. It was a parasitic signal, a virus disguised as a vibration. If that bike stayed active for another 10 minutes, it wouldn't just stall. It would turn into a resonance bomb, shattering every stabilizer in a 3-kilometer radius. "Voider's breath," I cursed. "They didn't just trace me. They used you as a delivery system." The first interceptor touched down at the end of the alley, its doors hissing open. A squad of armored guards stepped out, their ceremonial halberds glowing with lethal energy. At their head was a tall, silver-furred Felinari officer with more medals than sense. "Matriarch Elora," the officer shouted. "Step away from the human. Silas Vane, you are under arrest for high-tech heresy and the abduction of a great house scion." Elora looked at me, her amber eyes searching mine. "Can you fix it?" I looked at the guards. I looked at the ticking time bomb of a machine. My sarcastic remarks died in my throat. I was an architect. I was a man who hated broken things more than I feared the law. "Get on the back," I growled, reaching for my multi-tool. "What?" "I said, get on the back, kid. I can't fix it if I'm not inside the feedback loop, and we're going to need to move very, very fast." I didn't wait for her answer. I leaped onto the seat, my hands blurring as I ripped the cowling off the engine. The guards were charging now, their boots thundering on the metal floor. I jammed my multi-tool into the heart of the resonance core, ignoring the electrical discharge that scorched my palm. 3, 2, 1, sync. The bike didn't just start, it roared. The discordant scream shifted into a pure golden note that resonated so perfectly with the city's grid that the air around us seemed to ripple. We didn't just take off, we vanished into a blur of light and sound. Gravity is a funny thing. Most people think of it as a constant, a heavy hand pressing you down into the dirt. But when you're riding a resonance bike at 400 kilometers per hour through the narrow, twisting anti-gravity lanes of the rust, gravity becomes a suggestion. It becomes a fluid you have to swim through. Elora's arms were wrapped so tightly around my waist that I could barely breathe. Her fur was matted against my jacket, and I could feel her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my spine. Behind us, the 12 black interceptors were not giving up. They were burning their afterburners, their siren notes creating a chaotic, clashing noise that threatened to destabilize our flight path. "Sector 7 control is locking the gates," Elora screamed over the wind. "They're going to box us in." "Let them try," I shouted back. I wasn't looking at the road. I was looking at the small, glowing display I had jury-rigged on the handlebars. The red line of the parasitic signal was still there, pulsing like a fever. I had stabilized it, but I hadn't killed it. Every second we stayed in the city's main grid, the signal was gathering more energy, feeding off the city's own power like a leech. "Listen to me, Alora," I yelled. "This bike, who tuned it last? Who touched the core?" "No one," she cried. "It's a Royal Foundry build. It was delivered to my Spire 2 days ago for the Alignment Festival. My mother said it was a gift from Proctor Draven." Draven, of course, the High Proctor of the Spire, a man who looked like a saint and thought like a butcher. He was the one pushing for the harmonic purity laws, a polite way of saying he wanted to kick every non-felonari off the planet. "He didn't give you a gift, kid. He gave you a detonator." I banked the bike hard to the left, scraping the side of a massive, rusted cooling pipe. Sparks flew, a brilliant shower of orange against the humid twilight. We dove into a maintenance tunnel so narrow that I could feel the heat radiating from the walls. "What are you doing?" she gasped as we plummeted into the darkness. "This isn't a transit lane." "It's a shortcut," I grunted. "And if I'm right about the math, the Admiral's pilots are too big-headed to follow us into a sewage drain." I was right. 3 of the interceptors tried to follow. One clipped a stabilizer fin and went spinning into a trash reclamation plant. The other 2 flared their brakes, their pilots realizing too late that their armored hulls weren't designed for sub-level plumbing. But the pursuit wasn't over. One interceptor, the lead vehicle, the one carrying the silver-furred officer, was still on our tail. It was smaller, faster, and the pilot was possessed by a special kind of fanatical devotion. "Target locked," a synthesized voice chirped from the bike's console. "Warning, high-energy discharge detected from rear." "Hold on!" I yanked the handlebars up, executing a violent vertical climb through an exhaust vent. A bolt of emerald energy hissed through the space we had occupied a millisecond before, vaporizing a stack of empty fuel cells. The heat was immense, singing the back of my neck. We burst out of the vent and into the mid-levels, the Emerald District. Here the air was scrubbed clean. The buildings were made of translucent crystal, glowing with an internal, soft light. Waterfalls flowed up the sides of spires, held in place by delicate gravity fields. It was a paradise built on the backs of the people in the rust. I leveled the bike out, the engine humming that perfect golden note I'd forced into it. For a moment it was beautiful. The city stretched out below us like a sea of stars. "You really are him," Alora whispered, her voice filled with a strange, terrifying wonder. "The one from the legends, the Archon who built the Song of Aethelgard." "Don't call me that," I snapped, my eyes fixed on the scanner. "That man died 10 years ago. I'm just Silas, the guy who fixes your toasters." "No toaster fixer can fly like this," she said, her grip softening slightly as the immediate danger faded. "And no one else can hear the discordance before it happens. My mother always told me the Archon was a monster who abandoned his creation. But you're not a monster. You're just tired." "I'm not tired, I'm realistic," I muttered. "I saw what they did with my song. They turned it into a leash. Every frequency, every note, every credit, it's all tracked. And now, they're using it to kill you." "Why me?" she asked, her voice small. "I'm just a daughter of a house. I'm not even a counselor." "Because you're the bearer of tone," I said, the realization clicking into place with the sickening sound of a locked bolt. "The Alignment Festival is tomorrow. You're supposed to stand in the center of the Grand Plaza and hold the resonance core while the city resets its grid. If this bike had gone off while you were there, the feedback loop would have killed everyone on the council, and Draven would be the only one left to restore order." The silence that followed was heavier than any acoustic dampener. Elora went stiff behind me. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was a witness. "We have to go to the council," she said firmly. "We have to tell them." "Are you joking?" I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Look behind us, kid. The council is currently trying to shoot us out of the sky. Draven is the council right now. We go there, and we're just turning ourselves in for the execution." "Then where do we go?" I looked at the map. There was one place in Aethelgard that was shielded from the main grid. One place where the resonance didn't reach because the architecture was too old, too thick, and too broken. "The sump," I said. "Level 0, the place where the city began. My old workshop is still there, buried under 5 centuries of trash. If we can get there, I can strip this bike and prove what Draven did. But the Admiral, he won't stop. Then we'll just have to give him something else to chase. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small metallic sphere, a resonance decoy I'd built for poaching power from the Spire lines. I jammed it into the bike's secondary port and began to upload our bioharmonic signatures. In 30 seconds, this little ball is going to broadcast our location to every scanner in the city. It's going to look like we're heading for the space elevator. But we're not? Nope. We're going to drop the bike into a free fall and jump into the garbage chutes. Elora looked down at the 5-kilometer drop beneath us. Her ears flicked in terror. You want us to jump? Gravity is just a suggestion, remember? I grinned, though it felt more like a baring of teeth. Trust the mechanic, kid. I know the landings are soft. Mostly. Mostly? I've survived worse. Now on the count of 3, don't think, just jump. I set the autopilot, grabbed Elora's hand and counted to 3. I didn't wait to see if she was ready. I pulled her off the seat and into the void. The wind screamed. The lights of the city became a vertical blur. For a moment we were weightless, 2 specks of dust in a gargantuan machine. Then the darkness of the garbage chutes swallowed us whole. Behind us, the bike, broadcasting its fake signal, rocketed toward the stars, followed by a swarm of angry, emerald-eyed hounds. We were falling into the trash, into the dark, and into a war we weren't ready to fight. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't running away. I was moving toward the center of the broken machine, and I had a feeling that by the time I was done, Aethelgard would never sing the same way again. Falling into a garbage chute isn't as graceful as the hollow videos make it out to be. There is no cinematic slow motion, no heroic soundtrack, just the frantic, bone-jarring reality of metal walls rushing past and the smell of ozone mixed with 3 weeks of discarded synthetic nutrients. I kept my arm locked around Elora's waist, pulling her small frame against my chest to protect her from the jagged edges of the chute. I counted the seconds in my head, a rhythmic pulse that anchored me. At second 15, the air pressure changed. We were dropping through the thermal layer that separated the mid-levels from the sump. The air became thick, humid, and tasted like a mouthful of copper pennies. Silas! Elora's voice was a ragged gasp, muffled by my jacket. We're going too fast! Trust the physics, kid, I yelled back, though my own stomach was doing somersaults. In 5 seconds, the automated sorting magnets should catch my boot plates. Just don't bite your tongue. I didn't tell her that the magnets were over 300 years old and hadn't been serviced since before she was born. I didn't tell her that if the secondary induction coils had rusted through, we weren't going to land. We were going to become a very messy footnote at the bottom of the city's digestive tract. 4, 3, 2, 1. A violent, invisible hand suddenly grabbed us. The magnetic field hit the lead-line soles of my boots with the force of a freight train, jerking our momentum from a terminal plunge to a slow, agonizing hover. My joints popped, and a groan escaped my throat as the sheer G-force tried to turn my skeleton into jelly. We drifted downward for another 20 meters before the field flickered and died, dropping us the final 3 meters onto a pile of discarded industrial filters. I hit the ground first, taking the brunt of the impact. The filters were soft enough to prevent broken bones, but they were covered in a layer of greasy soot that instantly coated my face and clothes. Elora tumbled off me, landing with a soft thud. She stayed down for a moment, her triangular ears twitching frantically, her chest heaving as she tried to pull the heavy, oxygen-poor air into her lungs. You okay? I wheezed, rolling onto my back. I think I left my soul on level 50, she whispered, her voice trembling. She sat up, wiping a smear of black oil from her cheek. Her shimmering silk coat was ruined, a tattered rag that looked more like something from a scrap heap than a high-fashion Spire. Where are we? I stood up, my knees protesting every inch of the movement. I reached out a hand, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it. I hauled her up, noticing the way her fingers shook. She was terrified, but she was still standing. That was a start. Welcome to the sump, I said, gesturing to the darkness around us. This is level 0, the place where the first stones of Aethelgard were laid before the Felinari even knew how to build a fire, let alone a spire. I clicked on a small, high-intensity torch on my wrist. The beam of white light cut through the darkness, revealing a cavernous space that felt more like a tomb than a city. The walls were made of massive, irregular slabs of dark basalt, reinforced with ancient iron beams that were weeping rust like dried blood. There were no glowing crystal panels here, no upward flowing waterfalls, just the steady, rhythmic drip of condensation and the distant, low-frequency hum of the planetary core. "It's so quiet," Alora said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I can't hear the song. Usually the city is a constant melody in the back of my head. Here, it's just static." "That's because we're below the resonance wells," I explained, starting to walk toward a massive arching tunnel to the north. "The grid doesn't reach down here. The basalt is rich in magnetite. It acts like a natural dampener. This is the only place in the city where you can actually think without the council's frequency wash telling you how to feel." We walked in silence for a few minutes, our footsteps ringing on the wet stone. I was looking for a specific marker, a symbol I'd etched into the foundation 10 years ago, when I was a man looking for a grave. I found it near a crumbling junction box, a small, stylized wave, the sign of the Archon. I pressed my palm against a seemingly solid section of the basalt wall. There was a faint, high-pitched whine as a hidden biometric scanner, powered by an independent nuclear battery, recognized the deep-layered dermal patterns of my hand. The stone didn't slide, it dissolved, the molecular bonds momentarily relaxing to create an opening just wide enough for two people. "Come on," I said, stepping through. "The air is better inside." Elora followed, her eyes wide as she stepped into my sanctuary. It was a subvault, a room no larger than a standard cargo container, but it was packed with equipment that didn't belong in the modern age. There were physical consoles with tactile switches, glowing amber monitors, and racks of crystalline processors that looked like they had been stolen from a museum. In the center of the room was a workbench covered in the skeletal remains of a dozen different engine types. "This is your shop?" she asked, walking over to a shelf filled with handwritten journals. "My real shop," I corrected, closing the door behind us. "The one in the rust was just for show. This is where I come when I need to remember how things actually work, rather than how the council says they work." I walked over to a terminal and began a localized diagnostic sweep. "We have maybe 6 hours before the Admiral's Guard realizes the decoy bike wasn't us. They'll start a manual sweep of the garbage sector soon. We need to figure out exactly what Draven put in your bike before they find us." Elora sat on a stool, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked small amidst the heavy machinery, a lost princess in a gearhead's basement. "Silas, back in the alley you mentioned the Nexus match. You said it wasn't a fluke." I stopped typing. I didn't want to have this conversation. I wanted to focus on the bolts and the wires, the things I could fix. But the look in her eyes, that amber glow of desperate need, was a frequency I couldn't ignore. "The Nexus match isn't just an app, Elora," I said, turning to face her. "It's a search algorithm based on bioharmonic resonance. It looks for people whose biological frequencies complement the architectural frequencies of the city. Most people get a match of 60 or 70%. That's enough for a happy marriage or a stable business partnership." "And us?" she whispered. 99.9%, I said, my voice flat. "But it's not because we're soulmates in some romantic, storybook way. It's because of the song." I gestured to the monitors, where the city's grid telemetry was scrolling in endless lines of golden code. 10 years ago, when I was designing the Aethelgard resonance grid, I knew the system would eventually grow too complex for the council to control. I knew they would use it for power, so I built in a safety override, a master key that could reset the entire grid if it ever became a weapon. But I couldn't just put it in a box with a red button. Draven would have found it. I took a breath, the weight of a decade-old secret pressing on my chest. I encoded the override into a specific biological frequency. I designed the city to respond to a very rare, very specific harmonic signature. I thought the odds of that signature occurring naturally were billions to one. I thought the key was safe because it didn't exist. Elora's ears twitched. "You're saying I am the key?" "Your biological frequency is the exact inversion of mine, Elora. When I was the Archon, my resonance was the blueprint. Everything I built was a reflection of my own harmonic state. You, You are the perfect counterbalance. Together, our frequencies create a perfect null wave. If we stand in the center of the Grand Plaza during the alignment, we don't just balance the grid, we can shut it down permanently. The room went silent, save for the hum of the processors. Alora stared at her hands, her expression unreadable. I waited for her to scream, to accuse me of turning her into a tool, a piece of equipment. I waited for her to run back into the darkness. So, Draven didn't just want to kill the council, she said finally, her voice surprisingly steady. He wanted to kill me because I'm the only thing that can take his power away. Exactly, I said. He must have been monitoring the Nexus Match database. When our signatures popped up together, he knew the override was active. He couldn't let us meet. He couldn't let the Archon find his key. And you, she asked, looking up, why did you stay hidden? If you knew the city was becoming a cage, why didn't you stop it 10 years ago? I looked away, my gaze landing on a blackened, half-melted regulator on the shelf. Because I was afraid, Elora. I saw what happened to the people who spoke out. I saw how the council used the resonance to quiet the dissidents. I thought if I just left, if I disappeared into the rust, the system would eventually fail on its own. I thought I could save myself by doing nothing. I gripped the edge of the workbench, my knuckles turning white. I was a coward. I told myself I was being invisible to stay safe, but I was just letting the monster I built grow stronger. I fixed machines instead of fixing the world, because machines don't ask you to be brave, they just need a wrench and a bit of oil. Elora stood up and walked over to me. She didn't touch me, but she stood close enough that I could feel the faint, warm resonance of her presence. It was a soothing note, a calm C major in a world of discordant noise. Being afraid isn't a crime, Silas, she said softly. But staying afraid when people are hurting, that's a choice. You caught me in the alley. You could have run. You could have left me with that bike, and you'd be safe in a sewer right now. But you didn't. I have a problem with broken things, I muttered, trying to reclaim my cynical shell. It's a professional hazard. No, she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. I think you have a problem with being useless. And right now, Silas Vane, you are the most necessary man in Aethelgard. Before I could respond, a proximity alarm blared on the console. A red dot was pulsing on the sub-level map, less than 500 meters away and closing fast. Company's coming, I said, my voice shifting back into gearhead mode. And they didn't bring any snacks. I grabbed a heavy impact wrench from the table, not as a tool, but as a club. I didn't know who was coming, but in the sump there were no friendly neighbors. Stay behind the processors, I told Elora. If the door opens and it isn't me, there's a manual release for the ventilation duct in the ceiling. You go up and you don't look back. You hear me? Silas, promise me, Elora, you're the key. The city needs you more than it needs a grumpy mechanic. She bit her lip, but she nodded. I promise. I moved toward the door, my heart hammering a rhythm that was anything but rhythmic. I was terrified. My hands were shaking and my mouth was dry. But as I looked back at the girl huddled among my ancient machines, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, the fear didn't matter. I wasn't just fixing a bike anymore. I was fixing a mistake. The sump was supposed to be empty. That was the official word from the Spire, a convenient lie maintained to keep the upper citizens from worrying about what lived beneath their floorboards. But as I stepped out into the damp tunnel, my impact wrench held ready, I knew the Spire was wrong. The red dot on my wrist display was stationary now, hovering just around the corner of the basalt corridor. I moved with the silence of a man who had spent a decade avoiding footsteps, my boots barely making a sound on the wet stone. I reached the junction, pressed my back against the cold wall, and listened. It wasn't the rhythmic tramp of armored guards. It was a scraping sound, a dry, rhythmic dragging that reminded me of a wounded animal. And underneath it, a soft, whistling breath, the sound of someone breathing through a damaged lung. I swung around the corner, my torch flared to full brightness. Freeze! Don't move a single muscle, or I'll vibrate your teeth out of your head. The light illuminated a figure huddled in the shadows. It wasn't a soldier. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was dressed in rags of heavy canvas that had been patched so many times they looked like a quilt of grease and dirt. His skin was the color of mushrooms, pale and translucent from a lifetime without sun. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were human, but they were clouded with a milky film, cataracts caused by the constant exposure to the low-frequency static of the foundations. He was dragging a heavy rusted cart filled with scrap metal. He blinked in the harsh light of my torch, shielding his eyes with a claw-like hand. "Easy, easy," the man rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "Not a hunter, just a scavenger. Just looking for copper. Gearhead, no trouble from old Mallow." I lowered the wrench, though I didn't put it away. In the sump, no trouble was usually the prelude to a knife in the ribs. "Mallow? You live down here?" The man chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Live? No. We endure. We're the ones the grid forgot. The frequency blind. The discards." He squinted at me, his head tilting like a curious bird. You smell like the Spire. Expensive oil. Clean air. But you move like a rust rat. You're a strange one. "I'm just passing through," I said, my voice softening. "Have you seen any black suits down here? High-level military?" Mallow's ears, human ears, scarred and tattered, twitched. "Hunters? No. But the stone is screaming, gearhead. Can't you hear it? The big machines above, they're out of tune. They're angry. When the Spire gets angry, the sump gets flooded." He wasn't crazy. He was sensitive. Living down here, away from the artificial harmony of the grid, his body had adapted to the raw vibrations of the planetary foundations. He could feel the sabotage Draven was cooking up. "Listen to me, Mallow," I said, stepping closer. "The Spire is more than angry. There's a pulse coming, a big one. If the grid crashes, the emergency vents are going to dump all the excess thermal energy straight down here. This whole level will become a furnace." The scavenger's expression didn't change. He looked at the walls of the tunnel as if they were old friends. "It's been a furnace before. We hide in the deep cracks. We survive. We're the ghosts in the gears, gearhead. You can't kill a ghost." "Silas?" The door to my vault hissed open, and Alora stepped out. She hadn't listened to my "stay behind the processors" instruction. Of course she hadn't. She stood in the light of my torch, her ruined silk coat fluttering in the cold draft. Mallow froze. His milky eyes went wide, and he dropped to his knees, his forehead touching the wet stone. "The bearer," he whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, religious awe. "The song. She carries the song." "Mallow, stand up," I said, confused. "She's just a girl. She's in trouble." "No," the scavenger moaned, his body shaking. "She is the resonance. Even down here in the dark, she glows. The foundations. They're quiet when she speaks. I haven't heard the quiet in 40 years. Alora walked toward him, her movements graceful despite the grime. She reached out a hand and gently touched the man's shoulder. As she did, Mallow's rattling breath slowed. His posture relaxed. For a moment, the tension in the tunnel vanished, replaced by a profound, unnatural peace. "I'm sorry you've been in the dark for so long," Alora said, her voice like a cool breeze. "We're trying to turn the lights back on, but we need help." Mallow looked up at her, a tear tracking a clean path through the soot on his face. "Anything. The ghost will help the song." "We need to get to the central induction spine," I said, my mind racing. "It's the only way back up to the Grand Plaza without using the main elevators. But the access shafts are guarded by automated sentries." Mallow stood up, his rags rustling. "The metal spiders? They don't see in the dark. They see in frequencies. They look for the grid pulse. If you walk like a ghost, they won't find you." He turned to his scrap cart and pulled out 2 heavy, tattered ponchos made of woven lead fiber. "Put these on. They'll dampen your heat and your resonance. You'll look like a pile of trash to the machines. I'll take you to the spine. I know the ways that aren't on the maps." I looked at the ponchos. They were filthy, smelling of stagnant water and ancient mold. But they were the best chance we had. "Put it on, Alora," I said, handing her one. "Time to go undercover." We followed Mallow deeper into the foundations. The tunnels became narrower, the ceilings dripping with a black, viscous fluid that looked like old engine oil. We climbed through narrow fissures and crawled across rusted catwalks that groaned under our weight. All the while, the low hum of the city grew louder, a thrumming pressure that I could feel in my marrow. "We're getting close," Mallow whispered, pausing at a heavy blast door etched with the seal of the first founders. "The spine is behind this. It's the throat of the city. Everything goes through here. Power, water, data." He pointed to a series of glowing blue sensors embedded in the doorframe. "The spiders are inside. Don't speak. Don't run. Just breathe slow." Mallow pulled a lever, and the door hissed open. The central induction spine was a miracle of engineering, even to a cynical architect like me. It was a vertical shaft 300 meters wide, stretching all the way from the planetary core to the very tip of the spire. In the center, a pillar of pure, pulsating energy, a captured lightning bolt, glowed with a brilliant violet light. Massive rings of superconducting magnets hovered around the pillar, spinning with a sound that was more of a feeling than a noise. Thousands of automated sentries, the spiders Mallow had mentioned, scuttled along the walls of the shaft. They were sleek, multi-legged machines with glowing red eyes that scanned the darkness for any sign of unauthorized movement. "Stay close to the wall," I whispered to Alora. We moved like shadows, the lead ponchos concealing our resonance. The sentries passed over us, their red beams sweeping inches from our faces. But they didn't stop. To them, we were just more debris in a city built on waste. We reached the base of the secondary maintenance ladder, a vertical climb of over 4,000 meters. "This is as far as I go," Mallow whispered, his hand resting on the ladder's rungs. "The light, it hurts my eyes. But you must go up. The song must reach the plaza." "Mallow," I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out a small, high-capacity power cell, the one I used to run my shop. I pressed it into his hand. "This will run your cart's heaters for a year. Take it, and get to the deep fissures. When the pulse hits, stay low." The scavenger looked at the power cell as if it were a star. "The ghosts won't forget you, gearhead. They won't forget the bearer." He turned and vanished into the darkness of the tunnels before I could say another word. "Silas," Alora said, looking up at the endless ladder stretching into the violet glow. "I'm scared." I looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair was a mess, and she was wearing a tattered lead poncho that made her look like a beggar. But her eyes were clear. The fear was there, but it wasn't in the driver's seat. "I know," I said, reaching out to straighten the collar of her poncho. "I'm terrified, too. My knees are shaking so hard I think I'm going to rattle the ladder off the wall." "Really?" she asked, her voice small. "Really," I said. "Courage isn't about being a statue, Alora. It's about being a mess and still doing what needs to be done. You're doing great, just one rung at a time. Don't look down and don't think about the 4 kilometers of empty air beneath your boots." "That's very comforting, Silas," she said dryly. "I'm a mechanic, not a poet," I reminded her. "Now move your tail. We have a city to save, and I really want to get a cup of decent coffee before the world ends." We started the climb. It was an endurance test of the highest order. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and the vibration from the induction spine made my vision blur. We climbed for what felt like hours, passing through the different layers of the city. We saw the underside of the industrial sector, the glowing vents of the hydroponic gardens, and the shielded conduits of the middle districts. At the 2,000-meter mark, we stopped on a maintenance platform to catch our breath. The violet light of the spine was blinding here, a pillar of raw power that seemed to hum with 1,000 different voices. "Silas," Elora wheezed, leaning against the railing, "why did you really come back? It wasn't just because the bike was broken. You could have walked away a dozen times." I looked out at the city through the gaps in the shaft wall. I could see the lights of the Emerald District, sparkling like diamonds on a velvet shroud. I could see the rust, a dim orange bruise at the bottom of the world. "I used to think my family was the vanguard," I said quietly. "I thought the people I worked with, the architects and the engineers, were my kin because we spoke the same language of math and logic. But when I saw them use that language to build walls instead of bridges, I realized I was an orphan." I looked at her, the girl who had walked into my shop with a broken bike and a broken soul. "Then you walked in. You didn't ask for the Archon. You didn't ask for a hero. You just needed a hand. And for the first time in 10 years, I realized that family isn't something you're born into, and it's not something you find in a blueprint. Then what is it? She asked. It's a choice, I said. It's choosing to stay when the fire starts. It's choosing to carry someone else's burden when yours is already too heavy. I'm here because I chose you, Elora, and I'm choosing the city, even if it's a broken, discordant mess. Elora reached out and took my hand. Her palm was rough, covered in the same soot as mine. I choose you too, Silas, even if you are a grumpy mechanic who complains about his knees. I managed a small, genuine smile. Good. Now we have another 2,000 meters to go, and I think I hear the spiders coming. The sound was a clicking, rhythmic tapping on the metal rungs below us. The sentries had found the trail. The lead ponchos were losing their effectiveness as we got closer to the high-energy zones of the upper city. Up, I said, my voice hardening. Now! We climbed with the desperation of the damned. The clicking grew louder, a tidal wave of metal limbs rushing up the shaft. I could see the glowing red eyes of the lead spiders now, their scanners locking onto our heat signatures. Silas! They're almost here! We reached the final access hatch, a heavy circular plate that led directly into the service tunnels beneath the Grand Plaza. I grabbed the manual override handle and yanked. It didn't move. It's seized! The thermal expansion has locked the bolts. The first spider leaped from the ladder, its sharp metallic claws digging into the edge of the platform. It hissed, its red eye pulsing with lethal intent. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I swung the impact wrench with everything I had. The heavy tool smashed into the spider's sensor array, shattering the glass and sending a spray of blue sparks into the air. The machine screeched and tumbled backward, taking 2 other spiders with it. Elora! The wrench! Jam it into the gear housing! She grabbed a smaller tool from her belt and jammed it into the manual override mechanism. I threw my weight against the handle, my muscles tearing with the effort. Come on, you stubborn piece of junk! Turn! With a scream of protesting metal, the hatch flared open. We scrambled through, slamming the plate shut just as a dozen spiders slammed into the other side. I threw the locking bolt, the heavy thud echoing like a funeral bell. We were in. The air here was cold and smelled of expensive perfume. We were beneath the Grand Plaza. Above us, I could hear the rhythmic chanting of the Felinari choir, a beautiful, haunting melody that signaled the start of the Alignment Festival. The city was singing its last song, and we were the only ones who knew the lyrics were a lie. We have 30 minutes, I said, checking my wrist display. The alignment starts at high noon. What do we do now? Elora asked, her voice trembling but determined. Now, I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the small copper charm she had given me. We find the stage, and we show the world what a real harmony sounds like. I looked at the girl, the bearer of the tone, and the woman she was becoming. She wasn't a princess anymore. She was a revolutionary, and I was just the man who was lucky enough to be her mechanic. Let's go, kid, I said. Time to break the rules. The service tunnels beneath the Grand Plaza were a masterpiece of acoustic engineering, designed to amplify the sacred frequencies of the Spire while dampening the messy organic noises of the thousands of people standing just 6 feet above us. As Silas and I crept through the maintenance corridor, the sound of the Felinari choir felt less like music and more like a physical weight. It was a rhythmic, pulsing drone that made the very marrow of my bones ache. They've already started the pre-resonance, Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the overhead conduits. He checked a small handheld scanner, his brow furrowed in that way that usually meant something was about to explode. Draven isn't wasting any time. He's ramping up the baseline frequency to 3,500 hertz. That's nearly double the standard ceremonial limit. What does that mean, I asked, struggling to keep my lead poncho from snagging on the wall-mounted sensors. It means he's prepping the grid to be more sensitive, Silas said, his fingers dancing over the scanner's controls. It's like tightening a guitar string until it's just about to snap. One tiny discordant note, like the one hidden in your bike's core, and the whole thing will shatter. He's not just looking for a crash, Elora. He's looking for a total harmonic collapse. We reached the final access ladder, leading to a concealed hatch behind the High Matriarch's private viewing box. Silas stopped, his hand resting on the first rung. He looked up, then back at me. For the first time since we'd met in that greasy alley in the rust, I saw a flicker of something other than cynical irritation in his eyes. It was raw, unadulterated terror. Silas? I reached out, resting my hand on his arm. His muscles were like knotted cables, his entire body shaking with a fine, high-frequency tremor. 10 years, he rasped, his gaze fixed on the hatch above. I spent 10 years making myself a ghost. I convinced myself that if I just stayed in the shadows, the world would eventually find its own way back to the light. I thought if I didn't play the game, I wasn't responsible for the score. You were protecting yourself, I said softly. No, he said, a harsh, self-loathing edge to his voice. I was hiding because I was spooked. I saw what they did to my work, and instead of fighting for it, I bugged out. I let them take the song and turn it into a weapon because I didn't have the stones to stand my ground. He looked at the copper charm I'd given him, which he'd tied to the zipper of his jumpsuit. And now I'm about to walk out there in front of every camera in the city and tell the most powerful man in the sector that he's a liar. I'm about to give up the only thing I have left, my invisibility. You're not giving it up, I told him, stepping closer until our resonance began to mingle, creating that strange, soothing null wave. You're trading it for something better. You're trading it for the truth. Silas took a long, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I felt the frequency of his panic settle into a grim, determined hum. Right, the truth. Let's hope the truth doesn't get us KIA before I can finish the diagnostic. He grabbed the ladder and began to climb. I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We reached the top, and Silas eased the hatch open an inch. A blast of artificial jasmine perfume and the roar of 100,000 voices hit us instantly. We were directly behind the silk-draped balustrade of the Valerius box. I could see the back of my mother's head, her silver fur groomed to a mirror-like sheen, her ceremonial robes heavy with embroidery that told the story of 1,000 years of family honor. She was standing tall, her posture perfect, but I could see the way her ears were pinned back, a sign of extreme stress that only another Felinari would recognize. Beside her sat Proctor Draven. He looked exactly as he did in the Holoviews, elegant, serene, and utterly cold. He was dressed in robes of pure white, his charcoal fur providing a stark, striking contrast. He wasn't watching the choir. He was looking at a small, gold-rimmed data slate in his hand, a thin smile playing across his lips. On my signal, Silas whispered, his hand on the latch. We don't run for the center stage. We run for the primary induction node, that big crystal pillar in the middle of the plaza. If I can get my multi-tool into the physical interface, I can broadcast the sabotage logs to every screen in the city. But the guards, I'll handle the guards, Silas said, pulling a small, heavy object from his pocket. It looked like a flashbang, but I knew his work. It was a localized acoustic disruptor. Just keep your head down and stay within 5 meters of me. My poncho will mask your signature until we're on the platform. Silas didn't count to 3. He just kicked the hatch open and leaped onto the floor of the viewing box. Matriarch! Silas roared, his voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the box. My mother spun around, her eyes widening in shock. The guards at the edges of the box reached for their halberds, but Silas was faster. He slammed the acoustic disruptor onto the floor. A high-pitched, agonizing whine erupted from the device. It wasn't loud, but it was tuned to the specific frequency of Felinari ear canals. Every guard in the box collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads in pain. Even my mother staggered, her face contorting in agony. Only Draven remained unmoved. He had earplugs, I realized. He had known we were coming. Silas Vane, Draven said, his voice smooth and unaffected by the noise. He didn't stand up. He just looked at Silas with the detached interest of a collector, looking at a particularly stubborn insect. The Archon returns to his cathedral. I must say, I expected you to look less greasy. The grease is real, Draven, Silas growled, his multi-tool already out and humming, which is more than I can say for your harmonic purity act. Elora! My mother's voice was a ragged gasp. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and betrayal. What have you done? Who is this man? He's the one who saved me, Mother, I shouted, stepping forward. I pulled off the lead poncho, my ruined silk robes catching the sunlight. Draven tried to kill me. He rigged my bike to explode during the alignment. Lies and discordance, Draven said, finally standing up. He gestured to the plaza below, where the music had stopped. 100,000 people were staring up at our box, their faces a sea of confusion. The girl has been corrupted by human influence. She has spent too much time in the rust, listening to the broken frequencies of the unwanted. "Check the logs, Kestrel," Silas yelled, pointing his scanner at the matriarch. "I've got the raw data from her bike. It's got Draven's digital signature all over the resonance spike. He wasn't just trying to kill her. He was using her to trigger a grid collapse so he could seize emergency powers." My mother looked at Draven, then back at Silas. I could see the internal battle in her eyes, the weight of tradition, the fear of scandal, and the ancient primal instinct of a mother. "Show me," she whispered. "No," Draven said. He didn't shout. He didn't even sound angry. He simply raised his hand and pressed a button on his data slate. The Grand Plaza didn't just vibrate, it groaned. A deep, sickening thrum erupted from the central induction pillar. The blue light of the grid turned a violent, bruised purple. Overhead, the anti-gravity lanes flickered and died. A heavy cargo hauler, caught in the sudden loss of lift, slammed into the side of a spire 2 kilometers away. The sound of the explosion echoed across the city. "The alignment has begun," Draven announced, his voice being carried to every corner of Aethelgard by the emergency broadcast system. "But the corruption is too deep. The human Silas vein has injected a virus into the heart of our city. To save Aethelgard, we must purge the discordance. Guards, seize them." The plaza erupted into chaos. The crowd, driven by panic and Draven's amplified voice, began to surge toward the dais. The guards who had been stunned by Silas's device were beginning to recover, their eyes glowing with a cold, programmed fury. "We have to move!" Silas grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the edge of the box. "We have to hit that node before the feedback loop hits 100%. Silas, the drop. Gravity is a suggestion, Elora. Now jump." We leaped from the viewing box, falling 20 feet onto the marble floor of the plaza. Silas hit the ground and rolled, pulling me with him. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We ran. The crowd was a nightmare. People were screaming, shoving, and trampling each other in their desperation to escape the violet glare of the failing grid. Silas moved through them like a ghost, his hands constantly adjusting his multi-tool to create a small, localized bubble of stable frequency that kept the crowd from crushing us. 10 minutes, Silas yelled over the roar of the dying city. "In 10 minutes, the thermal vents in the sump will open and vaporize everything below level 5. We have to kill the loop." We reached the base of the central induction pillar. It was a colossal cylinder of white crystal, 30 feet thick and reaching 200 feet into the air. It was humming with such intensity that the air around it was glowing with static discharge. 4 guards stepped in front of us, their halberds crossing to block the interface port. They weren't Felinari, I realized. They were human mercenaries, their ears covered by heavy, sound-dampening helmets. Draven didn't trust his own people for this. "Move!" Silas shouted, raising his impact wrench. The lead mercenary didn't move. He raised a shock baton, the blue energy crackling at the tip. "Proctor's orders, gearhead. Nobody touches the crystal." Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't plan a clever technical bypass. He simply charged. He ducked under the first swing of the baton and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling across the marble. He swung the wrench in a wide arc, catching the second guard in the helmet with a sickening clack. But there were more of them coming, dozens of them, and Draven was watching from above, his white robes a stark mark of his triumph. I looked at Silas. He was fighting with a desperation I'd never seen, his face covered in sweat and blood, his hands shaking as he tried to reach the interface. He was terrified. I could feel it in our shared resonance, a cold, sharp spike of fear that he was going to fail, that he was going to be the man who watched the world burn twice. "Silas!" I grabbed his arm, pulling him back as a halberd hissed past his ear. "I have to do it." "What?" "No, stay back, Elora." "I'm the key," I shouted, the realization hitting me with the force of a sonic boom. "I don't need a multi-tool. I don't need a console. I'm the inversion of the song. If I touch the crystal, I can ground the signal myself. Silas stopped fighting. He looked at me, his eyes wide with horror. Elora, no! The energy in that pillar, it's raw resonance. It'll burn your nervous system out in seconds. You'll flatline before you can even find the root code. Then help me find it, I pleaded, tears blurring my vision. You know the math, Silas. You designed the song. If you guide my frequency, if we do it together, we can balance it. Silas looked at the guards closing in. He looked at the violet light of the pillar. He looked at me. I could see the choice in his eyes, the choice between the safety of his silence and the lethal, beautiful danger of the truth. It's going to hurt, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's going to hurt like nothing you've ever felt. I don't care, I said, reaching for his hand. I'd rather burn out with you than hide in the dark alone. Silas closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and when he opened them, the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, absolute clarity. Okay, he said. On 3. 1, 2, 3. We both reached out and slammed our hands onto the vibrating surface of the crystal. The world didn't just end, it exploded. Pain is an inadequate word for what happened when my skin met the crystal. It was as if every atom in my body had decided to vibrate in a different direction at the same time. My vision shattered into a million white-hot needles, and the sound in my ears wasn't music anymore. It was the screaming of 1,000 dying stars. I felt Silas's hand grip mine, his fingers digging into my palm with a strength that felt like it was the only thing keeping me from dissolving into pure energy. Don't fight it, Elora. His voice wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from inside my head, carried by the resonance link we'd forged. Sync with it. Find the bass line. It's an E-flat, 3 octaves below the primary. Focus on the gap. I tried to listen. I tried to find the note amidst the hurricane of violet noise. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand in a landslide. The power of the grid was pouring through me, using my body as a bridge, a conducting rod for the sabotage Draven had unleashed. I felt my heart stutter, my lungs seizing as the frequency tried to override my biological rhythm. Silas, I can't. It's too much. Yes, you can. He was screaming at me, his mental presence a wall of iron against the chaos. You're the key, remember. You don't have to beat the storm. You just have to be the anchor. Give me your frequency, Elora. Give it to me now. I let go. I stopped trying to hold on to my sense of self, my fear, my name. I opened the center of my being and let my natural resonance, that rare inverted harmonic I'd carried my whole life without knowing it, pour into the link. The shift was instantaneous. The violet light around us didn't vanish, but it began to swirl, drawn into the vortex we had created. The discordant screaming in my head softened into a deep, vibrating thrum. I could feel Silas's mind working, his decade of architectural knowledge unfolding like a map. He was taking my frequency and weaving it into the grid, using me as a surgical instrument to cut out the virus Draven had planted. There, Silas whispered. The root node. It's a hidden loop in the 3rd-level stabilizers. Draven didn't write it. He just unshielded it. He's letting the city eat itself. Can we kill it? We can't kill it without shutting down the whole grid, Elora. If we do that, every life support system in Aethelgard will stop. We have to override it. We have to be the new song. Outside the crystal, the world was a blur of chaos. I could see my mother standing in the viewing box, her face a mask of horror as she watched her daughter turn into a pillar of light. I could see Draven shouting orders, his mask of serenity finally slipping to reveal a panicked, small-minded man whose toy was being taken away. I saw the guards trying to pull us off the crystal, only to be thrown back by the sheer kinetic force of the resonance. Look at the screens! Someone in the crowd screamed. Above the plaza, the massive holographic displays that usually showed the council's propaganda were flickering. The golden lines of the grid were being replaced by something else. A new waveform was appearing, a complex, beautiful geometry that looked like a blooming flower made of light. It was the visual representation of our combined resonance. It was the null wave. The violet glare faded. The bruised sky of the plaza began to clear, returning to the soft, artificial gold of a healthy alignment. The traffic lanes overhead, which had been sagging like wet ropes, snapped back into their perfect, gravity-defying arcs. But the cost was being tallied in my blood. I felt a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. My skin was beginning to blister where it touched the crystal, and my vision was fading into a dull, gray fog. The energy was too much for a biological container. I was a fuse, and I was about to blow. Silas. I know, kid. I know. Just 10 more seconds. I'm almost through the firewall. Just 10 more. A sudden, sharp impact jarred the crystal. I felt the link flicker, a surge of raw, unbuffered power slamming into my chest. I gasped, my grip on Silas's hand slipping. I forced my eyes open. Proctor Draven was standing at the base of the pillar. He had grabbed a heavy ceremonial mace from a nearby guard and was smashing it into the interface port, trying to break the physical connection before Silas could finish the upload. "You will not destroy my city," Draven shrieked, his voice cracking with a high-frequency hysteria. "It belongs to the pure. It belongs to the song." He swung the mace again, the heavy gold head slamming into Silas's shoulder. I heard the sickening crunch of bone. Silas groaned, his head snapping back, but he didn't let go of the crystal. He didn't let go of me. "Go ahead, Draven," Silas yelled, his voice sounding like it was being dragged through gravel. "Break it, but you're too late. The data is already in the buffer. The whole city just saw your signature on the virus." Draven froze. He looked up at the holographic displays. His name was there, etched in brilliant red letters next to the code for the sabotage. The truth was out. The Archon had spoken. "No," Draven whispered, his eyes darting around the plaza. The crowd was silent now, 100,000 people watching the man they had worshipped be revealed as a traitor. "It's a forgery, a human trick." "It's math, Draven," Silas spat, blood dripping from his chin. "And math doesn't lie." Draven raised the mace one last time, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. He wasn't looking at Silas anymore. He was looking at me. He knew that if I died, the key was gone forever. "If I cannot have the Spire," Draven hissed, "then no one will." He swung the mace toward my head. I couldn't move. I was locked to the crystal, my body a conduit for the cooling energy of the grid. I closed my eyes, waiting for the blow. It never came. There was a flash of silver silk and a blur of motion. My mother, Matriarch Kestrel, had leaped from the viewing box. She landed between Draven and me, her claws extended, her eyes glowing with a feral, protective fire that made the proctor stagger back. "Touch my daughter again," my mother said, her voice a low, dangerous growl that echoed across the silent plaza. "And I will show you why the Valerius family were hunters before they were nobles." Draven looked at her, then at the guards who were now lowering their weapons, their eyes fixed on the matriarch. He looked at the crowd, which was starting to move toward him with a slow, ominous purpose. He was alone. He dropped the mace. It clattered on the marble with a hollow, pathetic sound. "Now, Elora!" Silas's voice was a roar in my mind. "Close the loop! Finish the song!" I pushed. I gave the crystal everything I had left, every memory of the rust, every fear of the dark, every ounce of hope I had found in a grumpy mechanic's eyes. The pillar erupted in a final, brilliant flash of white light. A shock wave of pure, clean resonance rippled out from the plaza, washing over the city like a tidal wave of fresh water. Every light in Aethelgard flickered once, then settled into a steady, warm glow. The low-frequency groan of the foundations vanished, replaced by a soft, melodic hum that felt like a long-awaited sigh. Then the world went black. I woke up on the cold marble floor. My head was spinning, and my hands felt like they had been dipped in acid. I tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed me back down. "Easy, kid. Don't try to win a marathon just yet. Your nervous system is still rebooting." I opened my eyes. Silas was sitting beside me, his arm in a crude sling made from a tattered lead poncho. He looked like he'd been dragged through a rock crusher, his face a map of bruises and cuts. But he was breathing. He was alive. Did we do it?" I wheezed. Silas looked up at the city. The Grand Plaza was full of people, but they weren't fighting. They were talking. Humans, Felinari, and scavengers from the sump were standing together, looking at the screens where the full truth of Draven's plan was still being broadcast. "We did it," Silas said, a small, weary smile touching his lips. "The grid is stable, the virus is purged, and Draven is currently being escorted to the deepest, darkest hole the Council can find." I looked around. My mother was standing a few feet away, talking to a group of human engineers. She looked tired, but when her eyes met mine, she gave me a small, solemn nod. It wasn't a hug, but it was an acknowledgement. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a citizen. "Silas," I said, reaching out to touch his bandaged hand, "you're not invisible anymore." He looked at his reflection in a nearby shard of crystal, a greasy, battered mechanic who had just saved a world. He let out a soft, dry laugh. "No," he said, "I suppose I'm not. It's going to be a lot harder to get a quiet cup of coffee from now on." He won. "You could come back to the Spire," I suggested. "The Council is going to need a new Archon, someone who actually knows how to bridge the frequencies." Silas looked up at the glittering spires of the Emerald District, then down at the dark, familiar bruise of the rust far below. "The Spire is a nice view, Alora," he said, turning back to me, "but I think I've spent enough time in high places. There's a lot of work to be done down there, a lot of broken things that need more than just a resonance wash. They need someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." He stood up, offering me his good hand. "Besides, I have a shop to run, and I'm pretty sure Mrs. Halloway's still waiting for me to fix that demonic toaster." I took his hand and pulled myself up. My legs were shaky, but they held. I looked at the city, the beautiful, flawed, noisy masterpiece of Aethelgard. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a hood ornament. I didn't feel like a key. I felt like a person. "I think I'll help you," I said, brushing the soot from my robes. "I'm getting pretty good at diagnostics, and I know a guy who's a world-class teacher." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who's that?" "A grumpy gearhead I met in an alley," I teased. "He's a bit of a mess, but he knows his physics." Silas barked a laugh, the sound echoing through the plaza. He put his arm around my shoulder, leaning on me slightly for support. "Right," he said. "Let's get moving, kid. The coffee's getting cold, and we've got a whole lot of noise to make." As we walked away from the central pillar, leaving the light of the spire behind us, I realized that Silas was right. Courage wasn't about the absence of fear. It was about what you did when the fear was at its loudest. And as the city sang its new honest song around us, I knew that we would never be quiet again. The victory in the Grand Plaza felt less like a triumph and more like a massive collective hangover. The blinding white light of the null wave had faded, leaving the city of Aethelgard in a twilight of uncertainty. I stood on the balcony of the Valerius Spire, watching the traffic lanes. They were moving, yes, but the grace was gone. The vehicles were hesitant, their pilots twitching at every minor vibration. The city was a wounded animal, and the silence that had followed the chaos was heavy with the scent of ozone and fear. I wasn't wearing the ruined silk robes anymore. I was dressed in a simple, slate-gray tunic and trousers, functional clothes from my mother's personal storage that felt more like a uniform than a fashion statement. My ears were still ringing, a low-frequency hum that reminded me of the moment Silas and I had bridged the crystal. "You look like a ghost," a voice said from the doorway. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of those heavy work boots. "I feel like one, Silas. I feel like I'm still standing in that light, waiting for the world to stop screaming." Silas walked out onto the balcony, his arms still bound in a sling. He looked even worse than he had an hour ago. The adrenaline had completely flatlined, leaving behind a man who looked like he had been put through a heavy-duty recycler. He leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the rust far below. "The screaming stopped," Silas said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Now comes the hard part, the talking, the finger-pointing. The realization that the guy who fixed the world is a greasy human with a criminal record." "You saved them," I said, finally looking at him. "The council just issued a temporary pardon for every human in the industrial sector. They're calling it the Day of Harmonic Grace. It's the first time in 300 years that the purity laws have been suspended." "Grace is a cheap currency in this city," Silas muttered. He pulled a small, battered metal flask from his pocket and took a sip. The smell of synthetic ethanol hit the air. "Draven is in a holding cell, but he didn't act alone. He had friends, Alora. True believers. Static heads who think the only way to save Aethelgard is to burn out the discordant elements. They're not going to just pack up and move to the moons because the boss got busted. The harmonic guard is being dismantled, I countered, though I could feel the truth in his words. The shared resonance between us was still there, a faint thread that allowed me to feel the jagged edges of his anxiety. My mother is personally overseeing the transition. She's changed, Silas. People don't change because of one light show, kid, Silas said, looking at me with those eyes that had seen the heat death of the universe and found it inconvenient. They change because they're forced to. Your mother is a survivor. She saw which way the wind was blowing and she jumped. But don't mistake survival for a change of heart. I wanted to argue, but the door behind us hissed open. My mother, matriarch Kestrel, stepped onto the balcony. She was back in her full regalia, the silver fur of her neck standing tall, her eyes sharp and predatory. She looked at Silas with a complex expression, gratitude warring with a centuries-old prejudice. The council is in session, my mother said, her voice formal and cold. They are demanding the Archon's presence. They want to know the extent of the damage to the primary grid. Tell them the Archon is busy having a midlife crisis, Silas said without turning around. And tell them to stop calling me that. My name is Silas Vane. I'm a mechanic. You are whatever the city needs you to be right now, my mother snapped, stepping closer. Draven's loyalists have barricaded themselves in the secondary thermal exchange. They've locked the vents. If the heat isn't vented within the next 6 hours, level 1 through 5 will become a pressure cooker. Thousands of your people, Silas. Thousands of humans. Silas went very still. The flask in his hand creaked as his grip tightened. I felt a surge of cold, sharp anger radiate from him. Not at my mother, but at himself. The fear of being responsible for more deaths. The fear of the very thing he had tried to outrun for 10 years. The secondary exchange is a death trap, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. The fail-safes are manual. If they've jammed the gears, you can't just send in a squad of guards to shoot them. You'll spark the hydrogen lines and blow the whole sector into orbit. That is why they want you, my mother said. You designed the exchange. You know the back doors. There are no back doors to a physical gear lock, Silas shouted, turning to face her. I built it to be tamper-proof. I was a 22-year-old genius who thought he could prevent sabotage by making the system absolute. I'm the one who gave them the keys to the furnace. The silence on the balcony was absolute. Silas was shaking, his face pale beneath the soot. This was the cost of his silence, the cost of his fear. He had spent a decade pretending he wasn't the man who built the cage, only to find that the cage was now on fire, and he was the only one with the blueprints. I'll go, I said, breaking the silence. Both of them looked at me. Silas shook his head immediately. No, not a chance, kid. You're the key, but you're not a sapper. You don't know a thermal coupler from a tailpipe. I know you, I said, stepping into his personal space. And I know the resonance. If the loyalists are holding the exchange, they're doing it because they think they're the only ones who can hear the song. I can show them they're wrong. I can speak to them in a way a human mechanic can't. It's a suicide mission, Silas growled. They're fanatical, Alora. They don't want a conversation. They want a martyrdom. Then don't let me go alone, I said. Be the man who fixes the mistake instead of the man who regrets it. You told me courage isn't about being a statue. It's about being a mess and still doing what needs to be done. Well, look at us. We're a complete disaster. Let's go. Silas looked at me for a long time. I could see the battle in his mind, the desire to run, to hide in the dark of the sump, to be invisible again. But then he looked at my mother, then at the charm tied to his jacket. You're a real pain in the neck, you know that? Silas muttered, but he reached for his tool roll. Fine, but if we get KIA, I'm haunting your shop for the next century. Deal, I said, a small, grim smile touching my lips. We didn't take an armored transport. Silas insisted on a battered, unmarked maintenance skiff from the lower docks. We show up in silk and silver, and they'll blow the vents just to see us burn, he explained as he worked the controls with his one good hand. We show up as a couple of grease monkeys, and we might get close enough to pull the plug. The descent into the industrial sector was a descent into a hell of our own making. The air was thick with the smell of scorched plastic and stagnant water. The thermal alarms were already screaming, a rhythmic, soul-crushing klaxon that echoed off the basalt walls. As we approached level 3, the temperature inside the skiff began to rise. 110 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing, Silas noted, checking the environmental readouts. In 2 hours, the lead lines will start to soften. In 4, the moisture in the air will turn to live steam. We're on the clock. We landed the skiff on a narrow maintenance ledge 500 meters above the secondary exchange. The building was a gargantuan cylinder of black iron, covered in the scarred remains of 5 centuries of industrial use. There was only one way in, the primary intake flume, a tunnel designed to pull cooling air into the core. "We have to crawl through the intake," Silas said, handing me a heavy, sound-dampening helmet. "The resonance inside the flume is intense. If you don't wear this, your brain will turn to soup before we hit the first gear room." We entered the tunnel. It was a lightless, airless crawl through a throat of cold iron. The vibration was immense, a deep, subsonic throb that felt like it was trying to shake my teeth loose. I followed Silas's boots, the light from my torch illuminating the thick layers of soot and grease that coated everything. After what felt like miles of crawling, we reached a heavy mesh grate. Silas used a localized plasma cutter to melt the hinges, and we dropped into a cavernous chamber filled with the sound of grinding metal. This was the heart of the furnace. Massive gears, each the size of a Felinari house, were turning with agonizing slowness. Steam hissed from broken valves, creating a perpetual white fog that obscured the far side of the room. High above on a suspended catwalk, I saw them. The Harmonic Guard. There were 12 of them, dressed in the charcoal robes of the protocol office. They weren't soldiers. They were scholars and technicians who had been twisted by Draven's rhetoric. They were standing around the primary gear lock, their hands joined in a ceremonial circle. They were chanting, a low, discordant drone that was being amplified by the room's natural acoustics. "They're using a communal resonance chain to hold the lock," Silas whispered, crouching behind a massive piston. "It's a mental anchor. As long as they keep the chant going, the gears are frozen in a feedback loop. You can't even move them with a wrecking ball." "I can break the chain," I said, reaching for my helmet. "Elora, wait!" Silas grabbed my arm. "Look at the leader, the one in the center." I followed his gaze. The man in the center of the circle was young, barely older than I was. His fur was a patchy, diseased-looking brown, and his eyes were wide with a feverish, desperate intensity. He wasn't a villain. He was a boy who thought he was saving his world from a plague. "He's terrified," I whispered. "Fear is the most dangerous fuel in the galaxy," Silas said, his voice grim. "If you jump in there and try to outshout them, they'll just tighten the loop. You have to find the note they're missing, Elora. You have to show them the song isn't a wall." "What about the gears?" "I'll handle the physical lock," Silas said, pulling a heavy crystalline tuning fork from his roll. "Once you break their focus, I'll have exactly 10 seconds to jam this into the master harmonic before the failsafes reset. If I miss the window, the gears will shear, and the whole sector goes dark." 10 seconds, I repeated. "That's plenty of time for a genius." "Don't get cocky, kid," Silas grunted, but he gave me a quick, firm squeeze on the shoulder. "Go, I'll be right behind you." I stepped out of the shadows. I didn't hide. I didn't run. I walked onto the catwalk, my boots ringing on the metal. The chant faltered for a second, then doubled in intensity as the 12 heads turned toward me. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the steam. "In the name of the bearer, I command you to break the circle." The young man in the center stepped forward, his eyes burning. "The bearer is a puppet. She has been tainted by the human rot. We are the only ones left who remember the purity of the founders. We will purge the discordance, even if we must burn to do it." "There is no purity in a furnace," I cried, stepping closer until I was only 5 meters from the circle. "Look around you. You're not saving Aethelgard. You're killing the people who build it. The humans, the scavengers, the ones who give the city its pulse. Without them, the Spire is just a pretty tomb." "Dissonance must be removed," the boy screamed. "The song must be won." He raised his hand, and the resonance in the room spiked. The violet light of the fail-safe alarms began to glow, reflecting off the steam. The pressure in the lines was reaching the breaking point. I closed my eyes. I didn't reach for the anger. I didn't reach for the power I'd felt in the plaza. I reached for the fear. I reached for the memory of the rust, the smell of the grease in Silas's shop, the sound of a broken bike being fixed by a man who had every reason to stay hidden. I began to sing. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't a ceremonial chant. It was a messy, complex melody filled with the rhythmic grinding of the rust and the sharp, bright notes of the spire. It was the sound of the whole city, the beautiful and the broken, the high-born and the unwanted. I wasn't trying to drown them out. I was trying to invite them in. The loyalists' chant wavered. The rigid, perfect drone began to fray at the edges. One of the women in the circle started to cry, her voice cracking as my song hit a note of pure, unadulterated grief. The boy in the center staggered, his hands shaking. "No!" he gasped. It's not pure. It's wrong." "It's not wrong," I whispered, stepping into the circle. "It's just honest." The chain snapped. The 12 people collapsed to the catwalk, their mental links shattered by the weight of a song they hadn't been taught. "Silas, now!" I saw him. Silas leaped from the shadows, his one good arm swinging the crystalline tuning fork with a desperate, lunging strength. He jammed the tool into the heart of the gear lock, just as the master gear groaned. The room was filled with a sound like a thunderclap. A wave of white energy erupted from the lock, throwing Silas backward across the catwalk. For a terrifying second, the gears screamed, metal grinding against metal in a spray of blue sparks. Then the sound changed. The grinding stopped. The gears began to turn with a smooth, silent grace that hadn't been heard in the exchange for a century. The violet lights on the walls turned to a steady, calm green. The hissing steam subsided, and the temperature in the room began to drop as the heavy vents far above finally flared open. The furnace was out. I ran to Silas. He was lying on the metal floor, his face covered in a fresh layer of soot, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. I pulled his head into my lap, my hands shaking. "Silas! Silas! Talk to me!" He coughed, a cloud of black dust erupting from his lungs. He opened his eyes, blinking up at me. Did I get it?" "You got it," I sobbed, a laugh of pure relief breaking through the tears. "The vents are open. The sector is safe." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked up at the turning gears, his expression one of tired, profound peace. "Good, because I really didn't want to haunt your shop. The lighting is terrible." "You're an idiot," I said, hugging him tightly. "Yeah," he whispered, his hand finding mine and squeezing. "But I'm an idiot who stayed, and I think that's a start." As the guards descended from the upper levels to take the loyalists into custody, I looked at the 12 people on the catwalk. They weren't fighting anymore. They were just sitting there looking at each other as if they were seeing the world for the first time. The city was still broken. The politics were still a mess. But in the heart of the furnace, two people who shouldn't have been there had proven that the song was big enough for everyone. And as the cool air began to flow through the tunnels of the rust, I knew that the silence of the foundations was finally, truly over. Repairing a city is not the same as repairing an engine. An engine follows the laws of thermodynamics. If you align the valves and prime the fuel lines, it will run. But a city is built on the laws of memory and resentment, and those are far more volatile than hydrogen. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the thermal exchange. The day of harmonic grace had turned into a month of uneasy peace. The council had been forced to recognize the human contribution to the city's survival, leading to the first joint species infrastructure committee in Aethelgard's history. Silas, much to his vocal disgust, had been named the Technical Advisor Extraordinary to the council, a title that came with a clean jumpsuit and a permanent office in the High Spire. He hadn't spent a single hour in that office. Instead, he was exactly where I expected to find him, knee-deep in a flooded conduit on level 2, swearing at a seized water pump. "Silas, you have a meeting with the matriarch in 20 minutes, I said, leaning over the edge of the maintenance pit. I was wearing my new apprentice coveralls, which were already stained with the blue hydraulic fluid that seemed to be the lifeblood of the lower levels. "Tell the matriarch that Mrs. Gable's hydroponic garden is currently drowning in gray water because some idiot in the Spire forgot how a gravity check valve works," Silas shouted back, his voice muffled by the pipes. "The matriarch can wait. The cabbages can't." I jumped down into the pit, the cold, greasy water splashing up to my knees. "You're doing it again." Silas stopped hammering on the valve and looked at me, a streak of black grease across his forehead. "Doing what?" "Hiding," I said. "You're using these pumps as a shield. You think if you just stay down here and fix the small things, you won't have to face the fact that the whole city is looking to you for the big answers." Silas sighed, a heavy, weary sound that echoed in the narrow space. He sat back on a rusted pipe, his hands resting on his knees. The sling was gone, but he still moved his shoulder with a cautious stiffness. "They don't want answers, Elora," he said quietly. "They want a miracle. They want me to wave a magic wrench and make the last 10 years of hate and static go away. But I'm just a guy who knows how to read a schematic. I can't fix a social grid that's been rotting since the first stone was laid." "You're not just a guy who reads schematics, Silas. You're the man who showed them that the song can be different. You're the one who proved that resonance isn't about being pure. It's about being together." "It's too much weight, kid," Silas muttered, looking at his scarred hands. "I built the first one, and it became a cage. What if I build the second one and it becomes a bomb? I'm terrified that every time I touch a crystal, I'm just making it easier for the next Draven to come along and twist it." I sat down beside him in the water, ignoring the chill. I reached out and took his hand, my fingers tracing the lines of his scars. "That's the risk," I said. "Every time you build something, you're giving the world a tool. You can't control how they use it. But that doesn't mean you stop building. It just means you have to stay and teach them how to use it right. You can't just hand them the keys and run away again." Silas looked at me, his amber eyes searching mine. "You've grown up a lot in the last 3 weeks, haven't you?" "I had a grumpy teacher," I teased, though my voice was soft. "He taught me that being a hero is mostly just about showing up and refusing to leave." Silas let out a short, surprised bark of laughter. He squeezed my hand back, his grip firm and grounding. "Refusing to leave? Yeah, I suppose I'm pretty good at that." We were interrupted by the chime of my comm link. It was a high-priority signal from the Spire. "Elora? Silas?" My mother's voice sounded frantic, a rare crack in her icy composure. "You need to get to the Grand Plaza immediately. There's a crowd, a big one." "What kind of crowd?" Silas snapped, his body instantly tensing. "Loyalists?" "No," my mother said, and I could hear the confusion in her tone. "It's everyone. Humans from the Rust, merchants from the mid-levels, even the highborn from the Spire. They're bringing things." "Bringing things? What things?" "Just get here," she said, and the line went dead. We climbed out of the pit and sprinted for the skiff. The flight to the Grand Plaza was a blur of neon lights and rising tension. My mind was racing through a dozen different nightmare scenarios: riots, protests, another sabotage. But when we broke through the cloud layer and saw the plaza, I froze. The Grand Plaza was full, but there was no violence. There were no banners of hate. Instead, the 1,000-foot space was filled with thousands of small, flickering lights. People were standing in silence. Hundreds of species mingled together in a chaotic, beautiful tapestry. And in the center, at the base of the crystal pillar we had saved, was a mountain of objects. There were broken toasters, rusted engine parts, shattered crystal panels, tattered silk robes, and crude lead fiber blankets. There were pieces of life from every corner of Aethelgard. We landed the skiff and stepped onto the marble. The crowd parted for us, but it wasn't the fearful parting of the audit. It was a respectful, expectant silence. My mother was standing at the edge of the mountain of scrap, her face uncharacteristically pale. "What is this?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mallow, the scavenger from the sump, stepped forward from the front of the crowd. He was wearing a clean poncho, and his milky eyes seemed to glow in the ambient light of the plaza. "It's a tribute, gearhead," Mallow said, his rattling voice echoing in the stillness. "We heard the Spire wants to build a new monument to the Harmony. We heard they want to carve a statue of the Archon out of white marble." He gestured to the pile of junk. "But the ghosts, we don't want a statue of a man we don't know. We want a reminder of what we are. We brought you our broken things, Silas Vane, because you're the only one who knows that the broken things are where the real song lives." A young human girl, no older than 6, stepped forward and placed a small, bent copper wire on top of the pile. She looked at Silas with wide, unafraid eyes. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Silas looked at the mountain of scrap. He looked at the thousands of faces, the humans who had been invisible, the Felinari who had been trapped in their own perfection, the scavengers who had lived in the dark. He looked at the girl. I felt his resonance shift. The fear didn't vanish, but it was being outweighed by something massive, something profound. It was the weight of a world that was finally, truly, asking to be repaired. Silas walked over to the pile. He picked up the small copper wire the girl had left. He didn't use a tool. He just held it in his hand, his thumb tracing the bend. "I can't fix it alone," Silas said, his voice carrying across the plaza without the help of an amplifier. "I can't build you a perfect city. I can't give you a song that never goes out of tune. All I can do is be the man who stays and helps you find the rhythm when it gets hard." He looked up at the high spire, then back at the crowd. "We're not going to build a monument out of marble. We're going to build a workshop, right here, in the center of the city, a place where anyone can bring their broken things, their engines, their hearts, their ideas, and we're going to fix them, together." The roar that followed was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't the scripted applause of the council. It was a raw, primal sound of hope. Silas turned to me, his eyes wet with tears he refused to let fall. "Looks like I'm going to need a lot of 12mm wrenches, kid." "I'll start an inventory," I said, my heart feeling like it was about to burst. As the sun began to set over Aethelgard, casting a warm, golden glow over the mountain of scrap and the people who had brought it, I realized that the transformation had truly begun. It was going to be painful. It was going to be messy. There would be more sabotage, more hate, more failures. But as I watched the Archon of Aethelgard sit down on the marble floor and start to straighten a little girl's copper wire, I knew that we were finally moving in the right direction. We were no longer chasing a perfect harmony. We were learning to love the noise. And for the first time in 10 years, the city of Aethelgard was finally truly in tune. The grand opening of the Junction Workshop wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There were no silk-draped dignitaries or choreographed fanfares. Instead, it was a cacophony of metal hitting metal, the hissing of arc welders, and the smell of ozone that seemed to cling to the very air of the Grand Plaza. We had taken the mountain of scrap, the broken tributes of the city, and we hadn't moved them. We had built around them. Silas had spent 4 days without sleep, his eyes bloodshot and his face smeared, with a permanent layer of conductive grease. He moved between the workstations we'd established at the base of the crystal pillar like a man possessed. He wasn't just fixing machines. He was teaching 100 different people how to fix them for themselves. "No, no, no," Silas growled, leaning over the shoulder of a young Felinari student who was trying to calibrate a resonance gate. "You're treating it like a sacred relic. It's a heat sink, kid. It doesn't want your prayers. It wants you to scrape the carbon off the contact points. Look at the jagged edge. That's where the noise is coming from. Smooth it out." The student, a boy from one of the lesser Spire families, flinched but didn't pull away. He took a piece of abrasive cloth and began to work on the metal. "But the High Canner said the noise is a sign of spiritual impurity." "The High Canner is a guy who's never had to change his own oil," Silas muttered, wiping his hands on a rag that was more black than white. "Noise isn't a sin. It's a signal. It tells you where the friction is. You don't pray for it to go away. You find the source and you grease it." I stood at the central terminal, monitoring the plaza's grid output. For the first time in 10 centuries, the power wasn't a flat, perfect line. It was a living thing, full of tiny spikes and dips that reflected the activity of the thousands of people now living and working in the square. It was messy, it was inefficient, and it was the most stable I had ever seen it. My mother approached the terminal, her robes rustling against the marble floor. She looked out at the workshop, her ears twitching as she watched a human scavenger and a Felinari merchant working together to repair a heavy-duty cargo drone. "The council is calling it the Great Dilution," she said, her voice devoid of its usual sharp edge. "They are terrified, Alora. They see the lack of uniformity, and they think the city is falling apart." "It is falling apart, Mother," I said, not looking away from the data stream. "The old city, the one built on the illusion of perfection, is gone. We're just making sure that what grows back has stronger foundations." "And Silas?" she asked, her gaze landing on the grumpy mechanic. He has refused the pension. He has refused the seat on the high board. He lives in a tent made of military-grade canvas next to a pile of rusted toasters. He's exactly where he wants to be, I said. He spent 10 years trying to be invisible. Now he's the most visible man in Aethelgard, and he's realizing that people aren't looking for an Archon. They're looking for a neighbor. The conflict, however, wasn't over. While the plaza was a haven, the rest of the city was still reeling. Draben's trial was scheduled for the following week, but the vacuum of power he'd left behind was being filled by voices of fear. There were reports of skirmishes in the mid-levels, of Felinari families barricading their spires against the human contagion. The harmony was broken, and not everyone was ready to learn a new song. That afternoon, a delegation from the High Council arrived. They didn't come with guards this time. They came with lawyers and architects. At their head was Chancellor Van, an elderly Felinari, whose fur was the color of ancient ash. He stood at the edge of the workshop, his nose wrinkling at the smell of fried noodles and hydraulic fluid. "Master Silas," Vaughn announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of protocol, "the council has reviewed your experimental community project. While we acknowledge your role in preventing the collapse, we cannot allow the Grand Plaza to remain a junkyard. We have prepared a new facility on level 10, a state-of-the-art laboratory where you can continue your research in a controlled environment." Silas didn't even look up from the engine he was stripping. "Level 10 is too high. The air is too thin and the people are too polite. I like it here." "This is not a suggestion, Silas Vane," Vaughn said, his tone sharpening. "The Grand Plaza is the heart of the resonance. By allowing this discordance to persist, you are threatening the stability of the entire planetary grid. We have reports of frequency drift as far as the southern outposts." Silas finally dropped his wrench. It hit the marble with a loud final clank. He stood up, his spine popping, and walked toward the Chancellor. He looked small, dirty, and utterly unimpressed. "The drift isn't coming from the workshop, Vaughn," Silas said, pointing to the massive crystal pillar behind him. "The drift is coming from the fact that your grid is trying to act like a single note when it's actually a choir of millions. You've been trying to force everyone to sing the same C-sharp for 1,000 years. Now that they've stopped, the grid doesn't know what to do with the silence." "Then fix it," Vaughn demanded. "You are the Archon. Rewrite the code. Restore the harmony." "I'm not rewriting anything," Silas said, "because harmony isn't a code you write in a dark room. It's a relationship. You want to fix the drift? Then stop trying to control it. Let the sectors manage their own resonance. Let the humans in the rust have their own nodes. Let the scavengers in the sump have their own lights. That is anarchy." "No," I said, stepping forward to stand beside Silas. "That's democracy. It's messy, it's loud, and it requires a lot of maintenance. But it's the only way to make sure the grid never becomes a weapon again." Vaughn looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pity. "You have been truly corrupted, child. You were supposed to be the bearer of tone. You were supposed to be the symbol of our perfection." "I'm a mechanic now, Chancellor," I said, holding up my hands, which were stained with the same blue fluid as Silas's. "And I've learned that the most important thing about a machine isn't how pretty it looks on a pedestal. It's how it handles the load when things get heavy." The Chancellor left, his robes fluttering in the wind, but the threat remained. We knew the Council wouldn't stay quiet for long. They were waiting for a failure. They were waiting for us to strip a screw or miss a beat so they could swoop in and restore order. That night, as the artificial sun dipped below the cloud line, Silas and I sat on the edge of the crystal pillar's base. The workshop was quiet, the students and workers having returned to their homes, leaving only the soft, rhythmic hum of the stable grid. "They're not going to stop, Silas," I said, looking at the copper charm he still wore. "They'll keep coming until they find a way to make this look like a disaster." Silas took a sip of his synthetic tea, his gaze fixed on the lights of the city. "I know, fear is a hard habit to break. They've been told their whole lives that anything they don't understand is a threat. It takes more than a few weeks to unlearn that kind of math. Are you sorry you stayed?" Silas looked at me, and for the first time the cynicism was entirely gone. He looked tired, yes, but he also looked whole. 10 years ago, I ran because I thought the grid was my fault. I thought if I disappeared, the problem would disappear too. I was wrong. The problem wasn't the grid, it was the silence I left behind. He reached out and rested his hand on the marble, feeling the vibration of the city. I'm not sorry, Alora. This mess, this beautiful, noisy, complicated disaster we've built, it's the first thing I've ever designed that actually feels like it belongs to the people who live in it. It's worth a few headaches. So what do we do when they come back with the guards? Silas grinned, his teeth white against his grease-stained face. We do what we always do, kid. We grab our wrenches, we find the friction, and we fix it, one bolt at a time. As I looked at him, I realized that the humanistic theme we had been chasing wasn't just a lesson we had learned. It was a practice. It was the daily grinding effort of choosing to stay, choosing to help, and choosing to believe that even a broken world was worth the repair. And as the stars of the spire began to twinkle above us, I knew that the real architecture of Aethelgard wasn't made of crystal or stone. It was made of the scars on our hands and the choices in our hearts. The 3-month mark of the Junction workshop was met with an unexpected guest. It wasn't a chancellor or a mercenary, but the city itself. A massive thermal surge, triggered by a faulty old world relay deep in the sump, threatened to overheat the entire midsector. The council's automated systems, the ones they had insisted were pure and perfect, had locked up under the pressure. The spire was screaming, its violet emergency lights bathing the upper levels in the color of panic. For 3 hours, the city held its breath. Inside the workshop, we didn't panic. We didn't wait for orders. Silas stood at the center of a circle of 60 technicians, half human, half Felinari. They weren't standing in a ceremonial formation. They were linked via handheld comm units, their screens glowing with real-time telemetry from every level of the city. All right, listen up. Silas's voice was the only stable thing in the room. The Spire's main frame is hunting for a fix it can't find. It's trying to force a hard reset, which will blow every transformer from here to the rust. We're not going to let it. But the council has locked the remote access, Mallow shouted from the monitoring station. We don't need remote access, Silas said, looking at me. We have the key, and we have the people. Elora, you're going to the secondary node on level 5. Take a team of 6. I'm going to the primary crystal. Everyone else, I want you to find every manual bypass valve in your sector. When I give the signal, I want you to open them. All of them. That will dump the resonance into the atmosphere, a Felinari tech cried. The noise will be deafening. Let it scream, Silas yelled. Better a noisy city than a dead one. Now move, bug out. The operation was a masterpiece of messy engineering. While the council sat in their shielded bunkers, paralyzed by their own protocols, the people of Aethelgard took the city back into their own hands. I stood at the level 5 node, my hands pressed against the vibrating crystal, feeling the pulse of thousands of people opening manual valves in perfect, chaotic synchronization. It wasn't a perfect sine wave. It was a jagged, roaring, beautiful burst of energy that bypassed the Spire's safety locks. I felt Silas in the link, his presence a steady, guiding hand. Now, Elora, ground the excess. Give them the song, I sang, not just with my voice, but with my resonance. I didn't sing for the founders or the rituals. I sang for Mallow in the dark, for the student with the abrasive cloth, and for the grumpy mechanic who had taught me that gravity was just a suggestion. The surge passed. The violet lights flickered once, then turned back to a steady, calm gold. The city didn't collapse. It breathed. In the aftermath, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of a job well done. The council tried to claim credit, of course, but the people knew. They had seen the human mechanics and the Felinari nobles standing side by side in the steam-filled tunnels. They had heard the song that wasn't a ritual. A week later, Silas sat on the steps of the workshop, looking out at the Grand Plaza. The mountain of scrap had been reorganized into a functioning library of spare parts. The students were busy, the air was warm, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't have his jacket zipped all the way to his chin. I sat down beside him, handing him a cup of coffee that didn't taste like money, but tasted like real, honest beans. The council just signed the new harmonic accord, Silas. Decentralized grid management, permanent residency for all species, and a public apology to a certain technical advisor. Silas took the coffee, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. He looked at his hands, the scars, the grease, the signs of a life lived in the gears. I spent a long time thinking I was the only one who could fix things, Silas said, his voice soft and reflective. I thought my genius was a burden I had to carry alone, or a secret I had to hide to stay safe. I thought the world was a machine that had to be perfect to be good. He took a slow sip of the coffee, looking at the diverse crowd moving through the plaza. But these last few months, they've taught me that I was looking at the math all wrong. The city isn't a machine, it's a conversation. And you can't have a conversation if everyone is afraid to speak. I thought I was fixing engines, but I was actually just learning how to listen. He looked at me, his amber eyes filled with a quiet strength. I used to be afraid of the noise, Alora. I used to be afraid of the mess. But now, I think the mess is the only thing that's real. I'm not an archon anymore. I'm just a man with a wrench, and for the first time in my life, that's more than enough. He stood up, groaning as his knees popped, and looked at the mountain of broken things waiting for his attention. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a mechanic starting his day. He looked like a man who was finally, truly home. I watched him walk toward a grandmother whose hover cart was stuttering, and I realized that Silas Vane hadn't just repaired a city. He had repaired himself. He had traded the cold, lonely perfection of the Spire for the warm, crowded reality of the workshop. He had learned that the most important tool in any repair kit isn't a wrench or a scanner. It's the willingness to stay when things get loud. I spent years carrying my fear like armor, believing that if I remained invisible, the weight of the world wouldn't crush me. I thought that by hiding my flaws and my past, I was protecting myself. But in the end, it was the grease under my fingernails and the scars on my soul that allowed me to connect with the people who truly needed me. I realized that perfection is a lonely tower, but a shared mess is a home. I found my family not in a bloodline or a title, but in the people who chose to stand beside me in the furnace. I find myself wondering about the world beyond these crystal walls. We all have parts of ourselves that we try to polish, to hide, or to silence because we think they make us less worthy of the song. We spend so much energy trying to be the statue the world expects us to be, fearing that if we show our cracks, we will be discarded. But I ask you, what is that one broken part of yourself, that scar, that mistake, or that unconventional rhythm that you have been trying to fix in secret? What would happen if you stopped trying to mute it and instead let it be the very thing that helps you connect with someone else? What if your greatest flaw is actually the key to the harmony we've all been missing? Silas picked up a 12-millimeter wrench and turned to face the next broken machine. He didn't look back at the Spire, for his eyes were fixed firmly on the ground.